Good morning, everyone. Welcome on another absolutely gorgeous MDI day. So happy to see you all. It is my real delight to welcome you to the Wednesday sessions of College of the Atlantic Summer Institute. First off, please silence your cell phones. And I'd like to welcome my friend, Judy Goldstein, to do the introduction of our speakers today. Judy is founder and executive director emeritus of Humanity in Action. Judy helped form and think about the Summer Institute from its very inception. She's really been a thought leader with the college for many years, a close advisor and mentor. I, this past year, this first of my presidency, have been the beneficiary of her keen insights, ideas, and suggestions. Please help me welcome Judy Goldstein.
Thank you, Sylvia, for the kind words, really. When Will and I met in Boston 9 years ago, I don't think either of us imagined that a College of the Atlantic Summer Institute, if we even called it that, would emerge as it has today. It's a work in progress, every year moving from strength to strength. The board, the college staff, which meticulously plans, and the participants who attend and listen on Zoom to these programs make this all possible. The Institute is aspirational, it's experimental, and ever striving towards excellence, which is so clear from the last 2 days. So bravo. Mel Brooks was 5 years old in 1931 when he watched a Frankenstein movie. What? Can you hear? Yeah, okay. The ogre scared the young boy, who was living with his immigrant mother and family in poverty and stifling heat in the Lower East Side. He insisted on closing the windows to keep out the monster. His mother pushed it open and proceeded to set the stage so that he could settle down a bit. This is what she told him, quote, "In order for Frankenstein to bite you, he's got to leave Russia, Transylvania, wherever he is from. First, he has to catch a train to a seaport. Then he's got to have money to get on a boat, a ship, to go all the way from Romania to America. And then when he lands in America, in New York, he's got to know which subway to take to Williamsburg. Then he's got to know which apartment to go to. So if he climbs up the fire escape, any of the windows, he'll eat someone on the first floor. Why would he climb to the 5th floor? So it worked. He went to sleep. He remembered her soothing concoction and made his own outrageous and benign Frankenstein movie 43 years later. So when I first read this passage in David Denby's latest book, I found it quite funny and sweet and delightfully simple. I mean, open the window because the monster couldn't make it to the 5th floor and devour Mel Brooks, the scared little boy, the little pisher. And the ogre was already satisfied by eating something along the way to the apartment. The fantasy worked. How funny, how simple, and truthfully, in one sense, how awful. Because if you eat someone else to be saved, what are you worth? This is a slice of humor at the expense of others, a common trait in humor. Nonetheless, if only we could tell ourselves stories that would convince us that a Frankenstein won't get us today. All of us, the vulnerable ones. But we can't escape into a fantasy land, especially one in which we are and others suffer, in our Frankenstein moment. Only a short time until the next election, and if we are lucky, an era if we are not. Unlucky, if it would be an era if we are not. We have our own Frankenstein, and all too many wannabe little Frankensteins that surround the big one. We have them as did people in the 19th century. For the abolitionists, slavery and inequality were monstrous violations of the moral order, Christian beliefs, and the American Constitution. The Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner took abolition on at great peril to his life. His history is the subject of the outstanding biographical study by Zaakir Tameez. Three women, Harriet Tubman, Martha Coffin Wright, and Frances A. Seward, confronted the double curse of abolition as well as male domination through social, political, and psychological imprisonment of American women. Whoever decided, and I think it was Lynn Bolger, who decided to pair Zaakir and Tameez and Dorothy Wickenden was truly inspired. The first-time writer, the very young man just out of law school, and the accomplished and distinguished New Yorker editor and prominent author. What brings them into joint focus on 19th century America are their marvelous depictions of courage on the part of Sumner in Zaakir's book, Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation, published in June, and Dorothy's, The Agitators, published in 2021. When one reads the two books, they talk to each other about the extraordinary 19th century history of abolition and women's rights, racism and idealism, marriage and its vast complexities. Today, courage is absolutely important for us to understand and incorporate in our lives as we face our own Frankenstein, one who embodies and feasts upon so many of the same poisonous potions of racism and violence in the 19th century. It is befitting that we speak of courage at a college of young people. They are going to have to take on the burden of righting the ship. Zaakir is one of this new generation of promise. I've come to know him since he became a Humanity in Action Fellow. In 2017, right after his fellowship, he wrote the following letter titled Lessons from Charlottesville to his hometown Houston Chronicle. And I quote, "Last Saturday, thousands of KKK members, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and members of the alt-right invaded our community for a rally. As a warm-up on Friday night, these groups also trampled through our university grounds with torches in their hands, screaming, 'Blood and soil, Jews will not replace us,' and countless racial slurs. Some students responded by going straight to the historic rotunda designed by Thomas Jefferson, hosting a banner around Jefferson's statue that read, 'UVA students against white supremacy.' The invaders, torches in hand, surrounded them, but these students stood their ground. I learned two lessons from that weekend. Here is the first. The proposition that all men are created equal means more than just words. Thousands came to my campus in direct opposition to the belief in equality. It will not be the last time the people assemble under the banner of bigotry. Building and maintaining a society where all men are equal is difficult, and democracy dies when its foundational phrases are forgotten." And he continues, "This is how democracy preserves itself, not just through mass protests and powerful phrases, important as they are, but also through individual people supporting other people, unified in the conviction of human equality." So from Charlottesville to January 6th to today, the challenges to an aspiring democracy is our challenge. It's the same as what these two authors have written about in their outstanding books on slavery and the Civil War. So I turn over the podium to them.
Thank you so much, Judy, for that wonderful welcome. And it is such a pleasure to be joining the Summer Institute this week with such an extraordinary roster of speakers, including one of my can't hear? How's that? Sounds very loud to me. Zaakir, who's one of my favorite speakers. It isn't every day that you get to talk about a moral giant in the Senate who loved provoking controversy. So that's one of the things we'll be getting into today. Sumner, he really couldn't have asked for a better suited person to tell his story. Zaakir, too, as you could tell from Judy's introduction, is a very brainy constitutional scholar, and he has been involved in protecting our democracy basically ever since he could read, as far as I can tell. He may be young, but he is extraordinarily accomplished, and he's a great writer. I highly recommend this book. It is his first. It's 550 pages, and he wrote it in law school. I mean, don't even ask. So Zaakir, and Judy touched on this too, he implicitly draws a direct line from the almost fatal attack on Charles Sumner, which you've all heard about, in 1856, to the mob's invasion of the Capitol in 2021. But as you'll see, it's not all bad news. This is really an very inspiring book too. So let's just keep that in mind as we continue in our discussion. We believe, I can say this for you, that there is a revitalization going on both among many, many professions, and you've heard a little bit about that this week, and at the grassroots. So it's important to note that too. But I think we need to begin with the caning of Charles Sumner. It really was, in some ways, the real beginning of the Civil War. But the controversies had been building and building, and the antagonisms over slavery had been well underway, really since the beginning, but especially building during the early 1850s. So tell us the story of what happened and how he basically invited the attack.
Well, thank you very much, Dorothy, for joining me. It's an honor just to be on stage with you, and I really appreciate getting to know you over the past few days. Thanks to all of you for being here on this Wednesday morning. Thank you to the Summer Institute for this wonderful program. This is my first time in Maine, and I'm very grateful to be here. And then thank you to President Sylvia and to Lynn Bolger and Sean for helping to arrange this, and of course to Judy Goldstein, who's my mentor and who has been very gracious to host me this week. So with all those thank yous done, now we're going to get a little more serious and talk about America in the 1850s. By this time, the United States has around 4 million enslaved people, which is more than the entire population of the 13 colonies during the Revolution. And these 4 million human beings in chains constitute around 25% of the population of the American South. 1/4 of the population effectively enslaved by the other 3/4. And slaveholders are desperate to make sure that slavery continues and is perpetuated in the South forever. They are also terrified of the prospect of domestic rebellion. And so, they are seeking to suppress abolitionist dissent. In many southern states, the government monitored the mail to make sure that there was no abolitionist pamphlets being mailed. There were certain states in the South where you could get the death penalty for helping an enslaved person escape, even if you were a white person. All this comes to fore in the territory of Kansas, which is a territory next to Missouri that is going to have a vote on whether to be a slave state or a free state. Slaveholders want to make sure that Kansas becomes a slave state so that slavery can continue to spread into the American West. At this time, Charles Sumner is a senator from Massachusetts, an anti-slavery northerner, and one of his former colleagues, named David Rice Atchison, is a senator from Missouri and the former president pro tem of the Senate. Atchison, a slaveholder, goes back to Missouri and organizes a gang of more than 1,000 men to storm into Kansas to take over polling locations at gunpoint. And he tells his men that if we can force Kansas to be a slave state, then we can spread slavery all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So there's a situation where a leading United States senator is literally organizing a violent, treasonous insurrection in Kansas. And while that's happening, there's relative quiet in Washington, D.C. Many anti-slavery Northerners are too afraid to speak out. Why? Because they live in a southern city, a slave city. Sandwiched between Virginia and Maryland, you could not go from the White House to Capitol Hill without passing at least 3 slave auction pens. Many anti-slavery Northerners had been receiving death threats or getting accosted on the streets of Washington, D.C. Sumner had a colleague named William Seward from New York who's anti-slavery, and I learned from one of your books that Seward's dog had been poisoned, presumably by a pro-slavery voter. So they live in this atmosphere of fear. And Charles Sumner is also afraid. He's gotten death threats himself, but he decides that he needs to speak out, that he cannot stay silent as one of his colleagues organizes an anti-democratic insurrection. So he decides to give a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. Often considered one of the most famous speeches of American history, it's often taught in schools. The Crime Against Kansas is a very provocative speech. Sumner decides that he needs to respond in a verbally aggressive way in order to draw attention to the anti-democratic threat. So he calls what's going on the rape of a virgin territory. Then he compares David Rice Atchison to a Roman traitor who had been hung for treason. He compares President Franklin Pierce to a Roman dictator. He compares Stephen Douglas, who is a pro-slavery senator from Illinois. He compares Stephen Douglas essentially to Lucifer. And then he targets Andrew Pickens Butler of South Carolina. He makes fun of Butler's hair. Butler had recently had a stroke, so he makes and was partially paralyzed in his lips, so he makes fun of Butler's speech impediment. He says that the state of South Carolina could be blotted out of existence and civilization would look the same. He might as well have called Butler Frankenstein, which he does not do, but he uses all this, and then at the end he says that Butler had a mistress, polluted in the sight of the world, but chaste in his own eyes. The harlot, slavery. Butler probably had an enslaved mistress who he had raped and had sired 2 children by her who were his own slaves, a common practice among slaveholders, particularly in South Carolina. And Sumner is telling the whole world about Butler's activities while Butler is recovering from a stroke. So obviously, Sumner's colleagues are not happy with this speech. And Butler had a nephew who's a congressman named Preston Brooks. And 2 days later, Preston Brooks approaches Sumner on the Senate floor with a gold-tipped gutta-percha cane. And he approaches from the front and starts to smash the cane into Sumner's skull. And starts beating him over and over and over again. Sumner fell unconscious almost immediately. Eventually, Sumner wakes up and he tries to get up, but his chair is manacled to the ground and he forgets to pull back the rollers. He rips the chair up like this and the desk tumbles, and then Brooks grabs him by the lapel and just keeps smashing his cane into the skull until the cane shatters into pieces. Meanwhile, Lawrence Keat, another congressman from South Carolina, is standing guard with a cane and, according to some reports, with a pistol to make sure nobody intervenes. Eventually, Senator John Crittenden grabs Brooks from the back and pulls him back and says, "You're going to kill him, you're going to kill him." And Brooks responds, I do not intend to kill him. I only intend to flog him. And the language of flogging and whipping was then used to describe what today we call the caning. Because Brooks was trying to show that Sumner was no better than a slave, and that Brooks is a white Southern gentleman, and that he should have power over Sumner. Now known as the caning, this is one of the most violent incidents in American history, and is often called, including by a contemporary from Britain, who saw this incident in 1856 and said, I predict this will be the first blow in a civil war.
And it was.
And it was.
It became a huge, huge political issue and really helped the Republican Party get underway, as Sumner predicted, even after the beating. Still can't hear. So it became a huge issue, and Sumner knew it would be, and he predicted that this was going to help the campaign, even while he was lying bloodied in his bed. But I want to talk just a little bit about why and we can see that he was politically aggravating, to say the very least, but why was he an outcast? What was it about his personality that drove people crazy?
So Sumner is a champion of equal rights. He had tried to integrate the schools of Boston only a few years before he got to the US Senate. He has a number of very close black friends, including Frederick Douglass and many others. And he is very uncompromising. And that's not necessarily the trait you want to be an effective politician. Depending on who you ask, he would say that's exactly what you should be. So a friend of his, Francis Lieber, once said that Sumner uses words as boys use stones to knock down flower pots and break windows. He's very aggressive with his speaking style. He's very uncompromising. And on top of this, he is a towering figure. He's 6'4", and always serious, never one for small talk. He kind of towered over everyone around him. He went to the Boston Latin School and then to Harvard. He's classically trained. He speaks Latin and Greek and French and German. So he's very intimidating to a lot of his colleagues. One of his colleagues, Carl Schurz, later says, and this is one of his best friends, says, Sumner is not the sort of man you could go up to, pat on the back, and say, hey, Charlie, how are you? In fact, almost nobody called him Charles, except a couple people, including Frances Seward, there were a few women who called him Charles, but for the most part, he insisted that people call him by his last name. So he's a very serious man. On top of this, he's also a bachelor. And he's a bachelor in a time that bachelorhood became stigmatized and a source of suspicion. Because of the influence from Victorian England, by the mid-19th century, many people wondered that if you were a bachelor, you probably had something wrong with you, because surely you'd be married by now or widowed if you were a normal person. So bachelors were suspected of being sexual perverts or of being even pedophiles. People wondered about this, and newspapers talked about it. He had been described as eunuch Sumner, a poor, sexless fool. One newspaper said he must have a weakness for young Negroes because he was an abolitionist bachelor. I argue in the book that Sumner is probably what we would consider to be gay. This is a term that didn't really exist at the time. The word homosexuality didn't enter the English lexicon until the 1870s, after Sigmund Freud's writings are translated. So at this time, Sumner did not understand himself to be gay. But he was very close to one male friend from Boston. And when that friend had gotten married, Sumner was heartbroken. That friend later said that he felt like he had gone to heaven with his wife and left his best friend outside. And Sumner spends much of his life very lonely. He ultimately does get married, and it's a bit of a disaster. He got married to a young widow named Alice, and she leaves him after a few months and starts to spread rumors that he was sexually impotent. which of course didn't have to help his reputation at all. So he's very much stigmatized. And the last thing I'll mention is that Butler, this senator from South Carolina, had once made fun of Sumner's chastity on the Senate floor, probably while drunk, and the whole Senate was full of hooters and hollers. He had said that Sumner should one day marry a princess with black skin and kinky hair. And the whole Senate started laughing, roaring with laughter. And this was at a time when many senators would often get drunk by the afternoon because there was free liquor in the committee rooms. And Sumner is a Puritan from New England. He's Puritan by culture, not by religion. And so he's not much of a drinker, he's not much of a smoker, and he's very uncomfortable in the Senate, which at the time was also a place of tobacco chewing. And senators would often spit tobacco onto the floor, even though there were spittoons available. And Charles Dickens, the famous novelist, once visited Washington, D.C., and he said, if anyone goes to the Senate, don't look down.
You describe him as a constitutional zealot, which he certainly was, and almost everybody in Washington, including his abolitionist friends, thought he was out of his mind. Explain his really peculiar, to me at least, as I know it, interpretation of the Constitution.
So Sumner went to Harvard Law School, and he was a student of Joseph Story, a famous titan of American law, a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and the author of the Commentaries on the Constitution, which is probably the most famous treatise of constitutional law ever written. So Sumner has this deep veneration for the Constitution from a young age. And that puts him in somewhat of a tension between many abolitionists who were very critical of the Constitution, which protected slavery in the states. William Lloyd Garrison, probably the most famous white abolitionist, on July 4th one year, was standing on a stage with Sojourner Truth and Henry David Thoreau. And as an act of protest, he took a copy of the US Constitution and lit it on fire. And he said the Constitution is a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because the Constitution protected slavery. So that's the sentiment among many abolitionists. But Sumner from early on would say to his abolitionist friends that we are citizens and this Constitution is the best of any in the world and it's not perfect and we should do everything we can to fight slavery but within the Constitution. Now here's the problem. The Constitution protected slavery. And on the Senate floor, Sumner was often confronted by Southern politicians who continued to point out, how can slavery be wrong when the founding fathers were slaveholders? How can slavery be wrong when Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Monroe are slaveholders, and even Hamilton, who's not a slaveholder, actually made much of his money off the slave system as a merchant. And so Sumner, though, insisted that even if the founding fathers, many of them were slaveholders, brutal slaveholders, that their ideals were pure. And he took this to the extreme. So for example, one time, a senator pointed out that Washington is a slaveholder. And Sumner mentioned that, yes, George Washington was a slaveholder, but he freed his slaves in his will. And so Sumner said, on earth, Washington was a slaveholder, but he went to God as an abolitionist. And he said, from Washington on earth, I appeal to Washington in heaven. Thomas Jefferson is a slaveholder who did not free his slaves after he died. But he wrote those words, all men are created equal. And so Sumner said that Jefferson was temporally a slaveholder, but had achieved immortality as an abolitionist. And he is just adamant about his veneration for the founding fathers. And I was skeptical of this because many abolitionists were not, or even if they praised the founding fathers, they did so strategically as a persuasive tool rather than something they really believed. But I've looked at all of Sumner's letters. He's got like 25,000 or so. And at least as far as I saw, I didn't see a single time privately where he criticized the founding fathers. So he had this very deep respect and veneration for the founding fathers, which definitely required, stretching things a little bit. But he really, he was effective in that way because he embraced the founding project even as he's embracing radical politics.
So we have to jump around a little bit because there's so much I'd love to talk to, but we don't have hours here. So jumping ahead to 1860, when the first Republican president was elected, Abraham Lincoln. This book is full of wonderful asides, and Zaakir writes that when Lincoln, months later, finally arrived in Washington, undercover, by the way, I can't remember if you mentioned that, you write, now there are at least 2 men in the city who are 6'4". But they had Lincoln and, well, all of Sumner's personal and political relationships were extremely complicated. And he was very close to Lincoln, but they really, early on, did not have, even though they were both Republicans, Sumner was a radical Republican, and you could describe Lincoln as being much more moderate. So how did Charles Sumner convince Abraham Lincoln that he must write an Emancipation Proclamation?
So when they first meet, they both realize they're 6'4", and Lincoln suggests that they should compare backs to see who's taller. And Sumner had no sense of humor. And he responds, Mr. President, we should not be putting our backs together. We need to be presenting a united front. And Lincoln later says, Sumner is we didn't have any bishops down where we live, but Sumner is my idea of a bishop. And that's the role Sumner served for Lincoln through the presidency, as his bishop, as his moral voice, as someone who's constantly haranguing him to do more. So Sumner was known to barge into the White House and literally interrupt Lincoln's meetings. He would berate the president and insist that he do more to emancipate. And going back a little bit, when Fort Sumter is first bombarded by South Carolina, the first battle of the Civil War, Sumner rushes to Lincoln and says that this is great news. Lincoln, of course, was probably full of anxiety about the future of the Republic. And Sumner said, no, this is great news. And he tells Lincoln that now that the South had bombed a Union fort, there was officially a state of war. And now that there is a state of war, the president could use his war powers. In a war, a president can kill people, can confiscate property, can burn down places. And as part of the confiscation of property, the president could, according to Sumner's theory, take the property of slaves and emancipate them. That becomes the theory of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what is striking is that Sumner got this idea from John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. John Quincy Adams was president of the United States, but then was in Congress as an anti-slavery spokesperson. And John Quincy Adams once said to an audience of African Americans in Philadelphia that the day of your redemption will come. It may come in peace or it may come in blood. Adams is confronted in the House by a Southerner who says, are you asking for violence? And Adams says, let it come, meaning emancipation. Let it come, though it may come in peace or in blood. Still I say, let it come. Let it come, though 1 million white men may die. Let it come, though the heavens fall. So Sumner had learned from John Quincy Adams, who's also from Massachusetts, the son of John Adams, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, that war, even mass bloodshed, could be morally justified in order to emancipate the slaves, because it was so righteous and it was so necessary, and that war could be a tool for emancipation through the war powers. Sumner explains all this to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln does not agree, but they argue until midnight. And they continue to argue and argue for the next 2 years, which was a sign that Lincoln was slowly warming up to the idea. Lincoln eventually came over to it, but he didn't think it was politically strategic because he wanted to keep the border states. But then come December of 1862, Lincoln does, in fact, decide to write the Emancipation Proclamation. He asks Sumner to review a draft, and then on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and he gives the pen he used to write it to Charles Sumner.
just tell us what Sumner asked for the pen?
Yeah, so Sumner very sheepishly asked for the pen. And he said, if no one's claimed it yet, please let me know. And of course, Sumner was one of the very few men in Washington who knew that the Emancipation Proclamation was coming soon. So he kind of got his way there. And then he gave it to a collector in Massachusetts. And now that pen is in the Massachusetts Historical Society.
And again, there are many really appealing qualities to Sumner for all those irritating ones. He said, if nobody has yet spoken for it, let it be me. And it's both kind of, it's just very Charles Sumner. But I want to talk to you a little bit more about women and his complicated relationships with women. He, very interestingly, to me anyway, he was close to Mary Todd Lincoln. I think we can talk about that later if we have time. I think in part because it was a politically strategic thing to do. And he also strategic, but very sincerely was an extremely close friend of Frances Seward, who was the wife of Lincoln's Secretary of State, William H. Seward. And Seward was one of Charles Sumner's great rivals, and Seward was very, very close to Lincoln. So that was a source of bitterness to Charles Sumner. Excuse me. But that is an aside. So he had this wonderful record on human rights, and one of the things that was going on simultaneously, as many of you know, with the abolitionist movement was the women's rights movement. And they held conventions together. The women leaders were speaking out very courageously at conventions when women weren't allowed to speak in public at all. And it was extremely dangerous. They had bricks thrown at them, stones. There were, as one of the women said, one of the leaders of one of these conventions says, there are lots of rowdies in the audience. These were young boys who would often try to storm the stage. Sometimes Frederick Douglass would attend these conventions, and in one of them, I think it was in Syracuse, he went up to the stage because there were some of these threats, and he said, if anyone wants to come up to the stage, I dare you. So this was really, really a big deal. Sumner, and I'll let you tell the story, approved what the women were doing. He was a very early advocate of the 13th Amendment. In fact, he tried to take control of the whole process in the Senate, which was typical. And the women, the women's rights movement, the two big leaders, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, decided that they would not, during the war, they would sustain their efforts for women, and they would just fight against slavery and really just be with the abolitionists all the way. So they too wanted to help get this amendment passed, and they started a very ambitious petition drive. Over to you.
They called it the Mammoth Petition. Their ambition was to get 1 million signatures. And these two women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, organized women around the country to go out into their communities and get signatures for a petition to abolish slavery. They often did many funny tricks with this. They would get kids involved and give kids badges if they could get 50 signatures or 100. And some of the petition rolls had a section for men and a section for women. And the community would have to compete to see whether more men or more women stood for the abolition of slavery. It was probably the women. So over time, they gather 400,000 signatures. And these signatures are delivered to Washington, D.C., to Charles Sumner's desk. And the scene, as is reported in some reports, was that two tall black men walked into the Senate carrying these giant petition rolls. And they come up to Sumner's desk and they plop it on his desk. And the Senate is astounded. This is the largest petition in American history at the time. 400,000 signatures organized by the Women's Loyal League for the abolition of slavery. And Sumner, when he gives the first speech on this, when the first 100,000 have been collected, he said, this is the prayer of 100,000. This is an army of 100,000 strong. So Sumner gives this booming speech in the Senate with all these petitions that the women had organized. And sure enough, within just a couple weeks, the Senate finally introduced an amendment to abolish slavery, the 13th Amendment. When that amendment is ultimately ratified, slavery has been abolished. Then you have the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection and birthright citizenship. And then you get to the 15th Amendment, which is going to guarantee black men the right to vote. When that amendment is introduced, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are furious because they're seeing the radical Republicans advancing the right of black men to vote before the right of white women to vote. And these women who had been abolitionists for a long time, who had been very close to Frederick Douglass, start to use very racist language. I forget which one of them, I'm sure you know. One of them said that she didn't want Patrick, Sambo, and Young Tung to have the right to vote before
Stanton.
she did. Stanton says this. Patrick being the Irish, Young Tung being Chinese, and Sambo being African Americans. So these extremely racist language. Sumner is very uncomfortable with this, and so he's put some distance between himself and the women's rights movement.
But can I interrupt for one sec?
Yeah.
This was appalling. What Elizabeth, not all the women, it was really Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, what they did with the 15th Amendment. But I will say, they felt there had been an implicit promise from Charles Sumner when he said, so Susan B. Anthony wanted to figure out how he could help in the Senate publicize his cause, the big cause of his life. And he said, send on the petitions. They give me a great opportunity for speech. So he was this egomaniacal, power-hungry politician with great, with great causes on his mind. But to him, he wanted to use the women's power to his own effect. And I haven't read the pamphlet you mentioned about the call of 100,000. But he wasn't really emphasizing the fact that women had done this. And by the way, this was the only political power women had at the time, which was petitioning. So of course they wanted the right to vote, and the implicit promise was if they, put down the women's rights cause throughout the Civil War, that their abolitionist friends would then pick it up and help fight for women's right to vote. So the whole thing came horribly apart with the 15th Amendment. But I would say that Charles Sumner, he could have distinguished himself more on this issue. He said in his speech, which Zaakir mentioned, he said, because it was the work of women, it was only a petition. Now again, he's right, it was only a petition, but that was the only right they had. Do not all great thoughts come from the heart? So I read that as a little patronizing. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. He never was a champion of women's rights, even if it was justified at that moment. After the 15th Amendment is ratified, and after black men do have the right to vote, Stanton and Anthony return to him and then ask him again, okay, how about now? And even then, in private letters to Stanton and Anthony and others, Sumner says, effectively that yes, women should have the right to vote, but they'll get it when they demand it. And effectively saying that he's not going to get involved with it. So he never was a champion for women's rights, even as he was a major champion for the rights of African Americans. So
there are two amazing death scenes in your book, and I am tempted to ask you to go into both of them. Well, please do if you want to. Sumner was always at very important turning points in the nation, and as soon as he heard about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, he rushed to his bedside. So I'd love Zaakir to talk about that. And then just this morning, I was reading again your description of Sumner's own deathbed scene, which brought me to tears. So he was extremely sensitive. He was quick to tears. He cried all the time. But his death scene is really one of the great moments, as is Lincoln's, in American history. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
So Sumner is having wine with two other senators when somebody comes to the door and says that the president has been shot. So Sumner immediately rushes to the White House, thinking he might find Lincoln there. He doesn't find Lincoln there. He finds Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's son. And he may have been the person to tell Robert Todd Lincoln that the president had allegedly been shot. And then Robert Todd Lincoln gets in the carriage with Charles Sumner and these others, and they go to Ford's Theater, learning that Lincoln may be there. They discovered that then Lincoln had been shot and been moved to a house across the street. So he enters a home with Robert Todd, and he sees Mary Lincoln is the first person he sees inside, and she's not being allowed to go upstairs to where her husband is dying. And she, in fact, would never forgive anyone for not allowing her to be at her husband's bedside until the very last few moments. So he comforts Mary Lincoln briefly, and then he goes upstairs. The Surgeon General of the United States is outside and says that nobody's allowed in, but you're a U.S. Senator, so I can't stop you if you want to go in. And so Sumner says, I will go in, and he barges into the room. And he goes straight up to Lincoln's bedside, and he grabs Lincoln's hand, and he starts saying, he's alive, he's alive. And the doctors are saying, no, he's dead. And Sumner says, but he's breathing. And the doctors say, but there will be no more than this. So Sumner stays by the bedside holding Lincoln's hand, according to one report, sobbing like a woman. And he sobs all night long. And then around 7 a.m. is when Robert Todd Lincoln and Mary Lincoln are allowed into the room. Robert Todd Lincoln holds Sumner's shoulder. Mary Lincoln is holding her son, and Sumner is holding Lincoln's hand. And that's the moment when Lincoln dies. After Lincoln dies, Sumner goes outside, and there's a crowd of mourners, and they ask him if the president still lives, and he shakes his head, which suggests that he was the first person to leave the house. And then Sumner goes home. Well, first he stops by the home of Secretary of State William Seward, who had been stabbed a number of times as well. So Seward had almost died. He spends a few moments with Frances Seward, Seward's wife, comforting her and holding her hands. Then he does go home, and he's getting a flood of visitors because people are now waking up in Washington, D.C., and are now wondering who had been killed and who's still alive. So people are wondering if Sumner had been attacked. He had not been, and he's safely at home, slumping over his breakfast table. And a guest comes in and starts to ask him, what's going to happen? Is the South going to restart the Civil War now that the president had been assassinated? And Sumner says, no, it's going to be fine. And then Sumner says, our leaders are gone, but the republic remains. In the weeks after Lincoln's death, Sumner continually invokes Lincoln's death and says that the country now needs to fulfill Lincoln's promise and to do what Lincoln would have wanted, which is to give the right of the vote to black men and to reconstruct the southern states on new constitutions that guaranteed equality for all, that guaranteed public schools, that guaranteed all sorts of progressive reforms that formerly enslaved people are now helping to right. So Sumner passed a bill called the First Reconstruction Act of 1867, which gives black men the right to participate in the constitutional conventions of southern states to rewrite their constitutions. So there are actually black founding fathers across the American South that we never talk about. The southern constitutions in many states, including Texas, where I'm from, these constitutions were written by formerly enslaved people at that time. Unclear whether Lincoln would have wanted all that, but Lincoln's now dead, and Sumner is using Lincoln's memory and Lincoln's death to advocate for these measures. Fast forward some years, Sumner drafts a civil rights bill that was essentially a national integration bill. It was a bill that would have created a right of public accommodation for anyone, regardless of race, to use a streetcar, to go to a hotel, to go to the theater. It's a visionary bill that Sumner got assistance from a black law professor named John Mercer Langston in writing. He had introduced the bill, and he had pushed for it for years, but it's not getting traction. Anti-slavery Republicans, by this time, aren't particularly interested in racial integration. Yes, they supported the right of black men to vote. Yes, they supported the right of black men to go to court, to own property. Yes, they supported the abolition of slavery, but the idea of blacks going to school with white kids, or going to church, or going on the same streetcar or hotel or theater was inconceivable to many anti-slavery Republicans who are still at their hearts racist. So Sumner's pushing for this bill. It's not getting traction, and then in 1874, in March, he has a heart attack. He's dying, and he spends all night high on morphine, and then in the morning, a number of people start coming to his door. Congress adjourns, and members of Congress start coming and walking the 40 minutes from Capitol Hill to Lafayette Square, where Sumner lived, as if in pilgrimage. The Speaker of the House comes to the home. The Senate chaplain is there. Many leading senators and members of Congress are there. Many diplomats are there. Military generals are there. Frederick Douglass is there. And as all these people are visiting Charles Sumner, Sumner keeps trying to get up. And there are these two close black friends of his, George Downing and James Wormley, who are holding him down. And Sumner is trying to get up to go to the US Senate. And of course, he is high off his mind on morphine. So he's not fully there. He's somewhat delusional. So they're holding him down. And then he keeps saying, "My bill, my bill." And his secretary assures him, "Don't worry, we will pay your household bills. You will not die in debt." And then Sumner gets alert all of a sudden and says, "No, you don't understand me. Take care of my civil rights bill. Don't let the bill fail." And he keeps saying, "The bill, the bill, the bill." And that's when people realize that he is trying to get up to go to the Senate to work on his civil rights bill. George Downing, one of his close black friends, recalled that only days earlier, Sumner had said, "Prostrate as I am, if I could crawl to the Capitol and pass the civil rights bill, I would be content to die." So he is pushing for this bill in his final moments. Frederick Douglass is so moved by this that he writes Sumner's final words, "Don't let the civil rights bill," on a note card that is still available in the Library of Congress today. The Speaker of the House is crying. Carl Schurz, another senator, is crying. The room is full of tears as the senator on his dying bed keeps saying, "Don't let the civil rights bill fail. Take care of the civil rights bill." After he dies, more than 40,000 people attend his various funeral events. And then his body is taken up first to Capitol Hill, where he lies in Abraham Lincoln's catafalque, the first politician to do so. He lies in state in the Senate. Then he's taken up to Boston, his hometown. And he lies in state in Dork Hall, in the Massachusetts State House. And there, as tens of thousands of people are visiting him, George Downing, the African-American who was holding Sumner's hand, his brother from Brooklyn, goes up to Boston and puts these flowers on Sumner's casket in white carnations, and with blue violet spells out, "Do not let the civil rights bill fail." And Harper's Weekly draws this scene of Sumner's casket with the words, "Do not let the civil rights bill fail," and prints that. Tens of thousands see this in person, possibly millions see it in print. And then Frederick Douglass launches a campaign to pass the civil rights bill in Charles Sumner's honor. The Senate passes the bill within 3 months. But the House keeps delaying and delaying until the next year. They whittle it down significantly. They do pass the bill. President Grant signs it. It's called the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And if it had been enforced, we would never have had segregation, because the bill created a right for anyone who is discriminated against to sue for damages if they are discriminated and if they are obstructed from entering a public accommodation. The bill is not enforced. 8 years later, the United States Supreme Court overturns it in the civil rights cases of 1883. You see the rise of Jim Crow, segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson, which is separate can be equal. You see decades of racial apartheid in this country. And then when you get to 1964, after John F. Kennedy is assassinated, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act that we know of today. And I got goosebumps when I looked at the first two provisions of this Civil Rights Act, because the first two provisions are nearly verbatim what Charles Sumner had written in his bill almost 100 years earlier. They got it from him.
So I want to get back to what we were talking about a little bit at the beginning, which is the direct line from the caning of Charles Sumner and what we saw in the attack on the Capitol in our own century. And we've been seeing now for many years the resurgence of violent white supremacists, which always comes, and history goes in waves, always comes with the persecution of African Americans and immigrants and women. And I wondered if what you think of what many say is today's version of a civil war. Are we in a civil war? Are we in the verge of the country splitting apart again?
So as Judy mentioned in the beginning, I was there in Charlottesville in August 2017 when neo-Nazis and neo-Confederates stormed our campus carrying torches, shouting, "Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us," blood and soil, very racist, ugly things. Then you get to January 6th, where white supremacists storm the Capitol, and there's a picture that was published by Reuters that shows a white supremacist carrying a Confederate flag, and in the back of the picture you can see the portrait of Charles Sumner. And according to the historian Eric Foner, this may have been the first time the Confederate flag was ever inside the US Capitol. 4 years of Civil War, the Confederate flag had never made it to the Capitol, which is of course what Robert E. Lee was trying to do the whole time. He never made it to Washington, D.C. And now in 2020, the Confederate flag finally reaches the Capitol. 2021, sorry. So we are in precarious times. We are seeing a resurgence of white supremacy. We are seeing anti-democratic rhetoric, anti-democratic actions on top of just rhetoric. And we are in a troubling moment. And the parallels between now and the 1850s are so stark that they can make us very uncomfortable. Now, being a historian of the Civil War, people often ask me what lessons to draw. And what they're really looking for is they're looking for something similar to what, they're looking for a story about how can we bridge people together and bridge divides to avoid this polarization, to turn the heat down, to avoid a similar crisis in this moment. And it's awkward to ask a Charles Sumner biographer how to bridge divides, because that was not his MO. So I say if you're looking for that, you're gonna have to ask a biographer of somebody else. But the lesson about Charles Sumner's life is less about bridging divides and more about standing for human rights. Thank you. So Sumner continually throughout his career stood for the rights of African Americans, and he was uncompromising about this, and unapologetic about the fact that he was uncompromising. He said that he was tired of compromise. He said once the country was afflicted by compromise, as if compromise was a kind of disease. And he said instead, there can be, or there should be, no compromise against human rights. When it came to the crisis of 1860, after South Carolina had seceded, there were many men in Washington, D.C., including many anti-slavery politicians, most famously William Seward of New York, who were trying to form compromises with the South to avoid war. And they were trying to compromise on slavery. So Seward had entertained the idea of a constitutional amendment that would make it impossible to abolish slavery in the future unless Southern states themselves desired it. Seward's wife, Frances, is furious with her husband over this. And she writes to him that how can you form a compromise that could lead to millions of people remaining in bondage? And Seward's wife, Frances, and Sumner are both on the same page here, and they're both telling Seward that he should not be compromising this situation. And Sumner is insisting that no matter what happens, we cannot compromise on slavery. And he says that there are few who can stand firm like the oak tree against the storm. And to him, no matter what political storm he was facing, no matter how sharp the divisions were, he said that it was necessary to stand to principle, stand for human rights, and stand firm like oak trees.
I just want to open it up for questions from the audience, but I want to end maybe not with Sumner, but with Frederick Douglass, who was he too was enormously complicated, and he changed his position a number of times. Should we engage in violence? Should we not engage in violence? He did approve of the Civil War for all kinds of obvious reasons. But in 1888, near the end of his life, he was actually addressing a women's rights convention, still being led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and he talked about the importance of women demanding the right to vote, which they were still doing. And then he said, and I've been waiting for an opportunity to talk about this, or just to put this in people's minds. He said, when a great truth gets abroad in the world, no power on earth can imprison it or prescribe its limits or suppress it. So that's what I think about when I'm feeling discouraged, and hope others will too. So now we're running out of time. We really want to hear from you, so please let us know. I think the mic is coming around.
You can pick either one. So one of them is, do you think there is someone like of the stature and the moral conscience of Charles Sumner today? And then the other one is, you're going to be a clerk for a federal court. Can the court save us?
So I think everyone will know those questions were not planted. Because if I were planting questions, I would not plant those too. So on the first, do I think there are modern Charles Sumners? I won't say if I do or don't, but I'll tell you what I think the bar is for modern Charles Sumner. When Charles Sumner saw his former colleague organize a treasonous, anti-democratic, violent insurrection in Kansas, he decided to speak out. And he had actually gone to the home of William Seward and Francis Seward to get advice and to read the speech out to them. And really what he was trying to do was just sort of show off the speech. He wasn't really seeking advice.
3 hours long.
Was it 3 hours long?
Yes.
So he has them sit for 3 hours to listen to his speech.
Which he had memorized.
And then I guess at the end he was like, well, what do you think? And both Seward and his wife, Frances Seward, both warned Sumner that the speech is very provocative and could lead to him getting hurt. They were very afraid that he could get attacked. And they urged him, they pleaded with him to moderate the message of his speech. And Sumner did not do that. But in not doing so, he was fully aware that he was possibly provoking an attack. He had seen Senator Butler almost get into a fight with another anti-slavery senator only a couple months earlier. And then he singles out Butler for his own speech. And in so doing, whether we agree or not, whether it was too provocative or not, clearly, Sumner was willing to put his own life on the line. He was courageous enough to do so. In effect, he was willing to put his life on the line for democracy. And 4 years later, when he returned to the Senate after years of recovery, he comes back and the first speech he gives is the barbarism of slavery, where he basically says that Southern slavery was the worst form of slavery to ever exist in the history of humanity. And he says that it's barbarous, and that slaveholders are basically savages. Another very provocative speech. And then other senators literally stood outside Sumner's home for days to guard his house. So he is willing to die to stop slavery and to protect American democracy. And the question is, who are our politicians today who are willing to put their life on the line for democracy? On the courts, thank you. On the courts, you know, it's a frightening moment. Sumner did not have much faith in the courts. He, of course, was alive when the Taney court issued Dred Scott, an opinion that said that blacks cannot be citizens and that slavery cannot be banned anywhere in America. Probably the worst decision of all time. he had often said that Congress should be able to pass legislation that the courts cannot overturn. That sounds crazy to us today. But in Sumner's era, the court almost never overturned an act of Congress. The first time was Marbury versus Madison in the early 1810s. The second time was Dred Scott. 40 years went by in which the Supreme Court always deferred to Congress for 40 years straight before Dred Scott. And then, a couple decades later, after Sumner has gone, the Supreme Court overturns the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And after that is when the idea of the Supreme Court overturning acts of Congress became common. In Sumner's era, it was scandalous. So Sumner believed that the Supreme Court is, quote, not arbiter of the acts of Congress. And he had also argued that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution, all of which included a final section that gave enforcement powers to Congress, essentially authorized Congress to pass any legislation in favor of human rights that the courts could not overturn. That was how he conceived of the separation of powers in that era. Very different from how we think of the courts today as a final actor in our democratic constitutional system. And so that doesn't give us answers about how we should consider the separation of powers today. But I do think it should open up new possibilities about how we think of the role of courts in our democracy.
Thank you. I have an odd question. It's for you to surmise. If the suffragette movement was in fact not racist, and if they had included the black women's movement, who they wouldn't even let stand with them, politic with them, sign, so that, do you think that Sumner might have been more interested if it were in fact also representing black women, that he might have been more interested in that movement per se?
Yeah, I'll give my thoughts and then I'd ask Dorothy to give her thoughts as well, because I think we'll both have opinions here. But they're very tentative opinions because as historians, we can't really know what the past would have been in this hypothetical. But Sumner had, when he delivered the Crime Against Kansas, he's mostly focusing the speech on the dignity and rights of black women who are being violated repeatedly by Southern enslavers. So on that angle, he very much respected black women and he was advocating for them as he's advocating for the abolition of slavery. On the other hand, he was never a champion of women's rights. He never was. There were times which Stanton and Anthony did suggest to him that if there was a women's rights amendment for women's right to vote, it would probably include black women. But that didn't persuade him. And so I don't know. It may have made him more warm to the movement because he was uncomfortable with this racism, but I don't know if it would have pushed him all the way.
I think I'd rather hear from more people in the audience, but I totally agree with Zaakir on that one.
Hi, thank you so much. In reflecting upon all this, there are certainly parallels in history, and the pendulum does swing, as you say. What I see as the huge difference right now is the speed and reach of communications, specifically the internet, which has entirely changed the game. When you talk about Civil War, before it was more geographic. Now it's, there's a word I'm looking for, but it's urban versus rural to oversimplify. And I think there will be pockets where it will seem to be Civil War, but it won't be nearly as organized as what it was in the 1800s. Please comment.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, yes, and on the other hand, no. On the one hand, yes. Well, I'll start with the no. We think that today politics are so rancorous and so vitriolic, and sometimes we're nostalgic for a past in which everybody got along. There never was that past. And in Sumner's era, he called one of his colleagues basically Lucifer, right? And they were extremely vitriolic in their speeches against each other. One time he called Stephen Douglas I'm not joking, it's a direct quote, a noisome squat of an animal. A noisome squat of an animal. Whatever that means. I guess he's an ogre, basically. So politics have always been very divisive, and politics have always been inappropriate in that respect. And so social media might exacerbate some of that, but it doesn't fundamentally change the nature of how we refer to each other. On the flip side, the speed of information means that we're less deliberative. We're not thinking as much. We're just reacting. We're liking, we're retweeting. Even politicians are just constantly tweeting, and there's a pressure to do so. If something happens in a politician's community, they're expected to speak about it within 5 minutes on Twitter. Otherwise, the question is, why didn't you give a statement? And then when they do give a statement, they're criticized if the statement is insufficient because the intern wrote it, because he had to get it done in 5 minutes. In Sumner's time, he would spend weeks preparing all of his speeches. He often memorized his speeches. He would deliver speeches that would go on for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. And people listened. The Senate galleries would be filled, often primarily with women who would come to listen to Sumner speak. He was really handsome, which helped. And then he would print his speeches, and people would read those speeches as well. And so they lived in a more deliberative time, even if the times were just as insulting as they are today.
I think we have time for one more.
I've found this whole thing fascinating, and as you began talking today about that speech, it reminded me the verbal strategies of a certain current president, which I find fascinating. And I kind of struggle with this in regards to his moral compass, which you've described. And I've just wondered if you've had any struggle with this or how you feel about it all.
So Sumner once said that, I'll give 2 thoughts. The first is that he had once been asked about why he's so vitriolic in his speeches. And he said that when we confront the enemies of God, we have the whole arsenal of God to use. Scorn, mockery, denunciation, and I will not renounce one of those weapons, not one. So he embraced scorn and mockery and denunciation in his politics. He also was he wasn't particularly concerned with the details of legislation. He wasn't very deliberative. He didn't spend much time working out the kinks of law. And you would think that's his role as a legislator. But he saw his role primarily as an orator and as a big picture ideas guy. One of his secretaries asked him why he didn't focus on the details of legislation. And before I saw this story, I thought he was oblivious to his own blind spot. But then he responds to his secretary and says, "Have you heard of the mother cuckoo bird?" So I see this and I'm like, why are cuckoo birds in this story? And then I have to go and learn up about cuckoo birds. So I start reading about cuckoo birds online, and then I think, wait a minute, Sumner didn't have the internet. So I need to go learn what would he have known about cuckoo birds in the 1870s. So then I start reading some encyclopedias from the 1860s on cuckoo birds, and then next thing you know, I'm reading Aristotle's book on birds. And so here's something about cuckoo birds, and then you'll see why it's relevant. Mother cuckoo birds don't hatch their own eggs. They drop eggs in the nests of other birds. And then they will go force those birds to raise her eggs. So the mother cuckoo bird will go and she will attack another bird if she doesn't raise her eggs as her own. So Sumner explains all this to his secretary and then says that the mother cuckoo bird is the smartest of all the birds. And effectively, his philosophy in politics was to be the big picture ideas person, plant these ideas, and then go and attack anyone who didn't pursue those ideas to completion. So that's one way to approach politics.
That is a great note to end on. Thank you, Zaakir, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a session. I'm truly breathless. And the first thing I'll say is the books are available right over here. So head that way. Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. And I'll just make note that our next session starts a little earlier today at 4:30 p.m. We will have a double header. We'll begin with The Troubles, Uncovering the Story with Patrick Radden Keefe and Daniel Zalewski, followed by The End of the Troubles, The Good Friday Agreement by our own Senator George Mitchell and Ambassador Phil Lader. We'll see you all here at 4:30 this afternoon again, and thank you again.